What it do, baby boo? Welcome, guys, to the 30-minute podcast. My name is Tito. I am your host, and this is the season 1 finale of the podcast. I've been at this for 13 weeks non-stop, 3 months. It's the consistency for me, and I think this is a good place to drop anchor on season 1. 13 episodes typically is like a season for most shows. So yes, season 1 ends here. Incidentally, on this episode, or this week rather, I'm commemorating or celebrating International Podcasting Day, which is this Saturday, the 30th of September. And in line with all of that, I'm going to be talking about my top 10 non-Nigerian podcasts. Now, real quick, what is International Podcasting Day? Let me pull it up. So the purpose of International Podcast Day, and this is from internationalpodcastday.com. The purpose is International Podcast Day is September 30th, and it's an international celebration of the power of podcasts. The celebration is a great opportunity to connect with fellow podcasters, podcast listeners, podcast enthusiasts, and leaders in the podcasting industry. So that's the purpose of International Podcast Day. Now, the history of podcasting, or I think the day itself, International Podcast Day. Just as podcasts and podcasting has evolved over the years, International Podcast Day has done the same. In 2014, the National Podcast Day was celebrated. After quickly realizing the power of podcasts internationally, we rebranded into what we are today, International Podcast Day, celebrated on September 30th. So, hey guys, happy International Podcast Day on September 30th. That's this Saturday. Feel free to let me know what some of your favorite podcasts are. It's always good to discover new podcasts. But in line with that, I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 non-Nigerian podcasts. In season 2, I will most definitely do an episode on my favorite Nigerian podcasts. I was going to give you a spoiler alert, but if you guys know me well enough, you know what my favorite Nigerian podcast is. You know what will be on number 1 of that list. But for the rest of you, let's keep the suspense going. So we'll wait till that episode comes out. But for today's episode, let's dive into it from number 10 to number 1. My least favorite of my top 10 to my actual favorite, i.e. number 1 podcast that I listen to. At number 10, we have the Really Good Podcast, hosted by Bobby Altoff. Now, if you like comedy, awkward jokes, I think you'll enjoy the Really Good Podcast. It's a very awkward, like I said, interview show hosted by Bobby Altoff. I'd never heard of her until I stumbled on the podcast a couple of months ago, and she has some really high-profile people on that podcast, right? Like I said, if you like comedy, and awkward jokes and awkward comedy, I think you'll enjoy it. My favorite episode, and I think the one I'd recommend to you if you're going to check out her podcast, which is not just available in audio version, it's available on YouTube as well. My favorite episode is the first ever one I watched, which was her interview with Funny Marco. That was hilarious. She's also had Drake on her show, but for some reason, that episode has been taken down from YouTube. I don't know why. It was hilarious as well. The episode she had with young Lil Yachi, I believe his name is. These rappers nowadays, their names are so weird. Anyway, that episode was really good as well. But like I said, the one I'd recommend to you and my favorite from the podcast is the one she had with Funny Marco. So that's at number 10. At number 9, I think it is, while I check my notes real quick. And like I said, guys, please feel free to let me know what some of your favorite podcasts are. Internationally and locally here in Nigeria. I hope my podcast is on that list. To be honest, I'm still finding my feet. 13 episodes in, I'm still trying to find my feet with this podcast and what this podcast is about. But I've made progress with each episode. That much I know. Number 9, we have the Colin and Samir Show. If you're a creator and you're into the whole creator economy space and you watch a lot of YouTube, you've probably stumbled on the Colin and Samir Show. They're YouTubers, and their podcast really focuses on the creator economy. They interview fellow creators from different parts of the world, and it's a very good show if you are the kind of person who creates particularly audio-visual content. It's a very, very good show. It's very, not very, but it's quite like intellectual. They ask smart questions. They just talk about the whole ecosystem of, being a creator, particularly as it relates to that particular guest that they have on each episode. And my favorite episode, and the one I'd probably recommend to you if you're to check out the podcast, is the episode they had with the Ali Abdal episode. Was really good, but I really have to say, I think my first ever episode of theirs that I watched was the one with Tim Ferriss, which was recommended by another podcaster who I follow, who is Nigerian but based in Canada, Fopsy. She has her podcast called Dear Fopsy. So she recommended it on her stories, and I think from there, because of that recommendation, I went to go and watch the episode on YouTube, and it was fantastic. Tim Ferriss is the author of The 4-Hour Workweek, a book that I really enjoyed, and The 4-Hour Workweek. Yeah, okay. The Subtle Art of Not Giving an AF that was Mark Morrison. I often confuse the two, but yes, my favorite episode of this Colin and Samir show was the one where they interviewed Tim Ferriss, who is also a podcaster, and to be honest, that episode really, it was like one of the things that inspired me to start my own podcast. So yes, the Colin and Samir show. At number 9, okay, I've made a mistake. So the Colin, oh gosh, okay, let me just try and do some. Do you know what? Let me just continue rolling. The Colin and Samir one was meant to be number 8, and the one I'm going to say now is meant to be number 9. So do with that information what you will. So the next one is How to Take Over the World, hosted by Ben Wilson. On this podcast, Ben, he just profiles some of the great men and women of history, right? People like Joan of Arc, Napoleon, Bill Gates. Has he done a Bill Gates episode? I know he's done a Steve Jobs episode. He just looks at the lives of these remarkable individuals, and it's cerebral, it's interesting, it's insightful. If you like history and if you like to learn about some key figures from history, I think you'll like How to Take Over the World. My favorite episode of the podcast that I've listened to is the one where he profiled Walt Disney. It's a 2-part episode, so there's a part 1 and a part 2. I really enjoyed that particular episode. It was very insightful. Walt Disney as a creative and what he created over 100 years ago. So the Disney company celebrated 100 years this year, 2023. I'm trying to remember if it's the company that's 100 years old or if it's Walt Disney that would have been 100 years old if he had been alive today. But I digress. The episode on Walt Disney is my favorite. The episode on Steve Jobs is also really good, but I'll stick with, if I'm to recommend an episode, I would recommend the one on Walt Disney. Now, my 7th favorite, and let me just check my notes and make sure that's actually number 7 we're on now. So number 10 was the Bobby Altoff's podcast, the really good podcast. Number 9 actually was How to Take Over the World with Ben Wilson. Number 8 was the Colin and Samir show. Now number 7 is the 90s Baby Show, which is hosted by Fred Santana, Tammy Alchemy, VP in the Cut, and some of you who will probably know the 90s Baby Show. It's very lighthearted. It's these 3 guys who are in the UK, the guys whose names I just mentioned. It's just bants and banter, and it's just being just off the cuff and just being so random, right? It's a hilarious podcast. I don't think I've ever listened to that podcast either. I always watch on YouTube. It's always interesting to see what they get up to, the expressions on their faces. Their sets because they've had different sets, which is why I said, all right, their sets have been quite colorful and vibrant, and I like their sets, but they usually have guests on the podcast. So very interesting. It's very urban, very, youthful and like urban black millennial. Yeah, more millennial than Gen Z. It's just the podcast is a vibe, and I think they've had Adekunle Gold on their podcast. They've had Simply Shayo. They've had Rachel Bada. They've had Ruga recently. I haven't listened to that episode, but the episode that I would recommend, or the one that was my favorite, the Simply Shayo episode was really good. But I will say my favorite episode was the one where they had Rachel Bada. I had never even knew who Rachel Bada was until I listened to that episode. But why that episode is my favorite is because it's from that episode that I discovered Victoria Monet, who is an R&B singer. Because at the end of each episode, at least back then, they'd ask each other what their song of the week was, right? And Rachel Bada said her song of the week was Asked Like That by Victoria Monet. And I was like, who's that? But I like that title. I'm going to look for that song. And I listened to Ask Like That, and I've been a huge fan of Victoria Monet's ever since. So because of that, the episode that they had Rachel Bada on is my favorite episode of the 90s Baby Show. My sixth favorite podcast that's not from Nigeria is the Iced Coffee Hour, which is a business and like finance podcast. It's hosted by a finance YouTuber, Graham Stefan and Jack Selby, who is started off as his assistant, but now he's risen through the ranks in Graham's establishment. It's very insightful. Graham is a great guy. He breaks down personal finance really well. He really blew up during lockdown in 2020. I've been following him since then, probably even before 2020, maybe 2019 even. And so on the Iced Coffee Hour, they invite a guest and they talk about that guest's business, or the monetary things associated with that guest's life and their business. And it's just really, it tends to be lighthearted. It's very insightful. They always make sure to try and infuse a little bit of personal finance into each episode or into each interview, and I really appreciate that. And it's really just a good time, learning about how to level up, how to scale up your business, how other people did things, and it's very transparent. Graham normally is a very transparent guy, and seeing Jack, his assistant slash podcast co-host, also learn along the way is very interesting. So yeah, it's a great podcast. I'm really into, from the 10 that I'm going to mention in this episode, most of them are personal finance or finance and business podcasts. And I think one of the top ones for me is the Iced Coffee Hour. And my favorite, or the one that I will recommend to you guys, is the episode where they've had Shelby Church, who's a YouTuber, on the podcast. They've had Nate O'Brien, another YouTuber, on the podcast. They've also had Kelly Stamps on the podcast. I would say that those three are my three favorite episodes of the Iced Coffee Hour. But the one I'd recommend, it's between this. Let me go with the Kelly Stamps episode. That was my favorite, and I think that's the one I'll recommend because Kelly was very that rhymed. Kelly was very insightful and she really blew my mind. She was learning how to fly. She was trying to get her pilot's license. She's done really well for herself with her businesses. She's a quirky individual. I think I'd been seeing her name on YouTube for a while, but once I watched that episode on YouTube, I became a fan and I subscribed rather to her YouTube channel after watching her interview on the Iced Coffee Hour. So yeah, the episode with Kelly Stamps. Now, where are we? Number 5, with the Perrys. Now, this is a religious podcast. It's hosted by Preston Perry and his very famous wife, Jackie Hill Perry, who I've mentioned before on this podcast of mine. So it's a faith-based / religious podcast where they talk about sometimes politics, lifestyle, love, relationships, several things, right? But they always tie it into faith because they're preachers, I do believe, and they're just a faith-based couple. They're known for being Christians, advocating for Christ and all that. And their podcast is quite insightful. It used to be just 30 minutes. I think now because they started the new season a few weeks ago, and I think now they go beyond 30 minutes. If you're a Christian, if you're into faith, if you're a fan of Jackie Hill Perry's, I think you'll enjoy the podcast, especially if you don't know of it already. Most of her fans know about that podcast, but if you're a fan of hers, you know who she is, you enjoy her content on Instagram, I think you should listen to her podcast with her husband, Preston Perry. And my favorite episode of the podcast with the Perrys will be the one. Okay, so there are two. There's one called "What We Wish We Knew About Sex." That was interesting, and I think the first ever one I listened to of their podcast, which was so about dating, because I'm really into dating and whatnot. So I think that one really struck a chord with me. So yeah, if you're going to check out their podcast with the Perrys, I recommend the episode titled "So About Dating" or the one titled "What We Wish We Knew About Sex." Now let me take a quick drink or a quick sip of my drink, as we're already in the second half. Yeah, this is the final half. With the Perrys was number 5. All right. The next podcast is the TMI podcast, or the Messy In Between podcast. Now this is a Kenyan podcast hosted by two lovely ladies, Lydia KM and Murugi Munyi. I don't even know how I stumbled on their podcast a few months ago. No, it was last year, not even a few months. I've been listening to that podcast for over a year, I think. And their growth has been really interesting. It started as many of these things do, started as like a passion project, two women just getting together to talk about relationships, self-love, sex and whatnot, and it has really grown. Their community has grown. It has grown before my eyes, and I'm very happy for the ladies. I think they recently crossed 100,000 subscribers. I remember when they crossed 50,000 subscribers, and they are incredibly transparent on that podcast. And they're Kenyans, so now there are two Kenyan podcasts that I listen to, but this was the first one, and the conversations are just so rich. I love the banter and the relationship between both ladies, Lydia and Murungi. And my favorite episodes, and the ones that I always have like two. It's always hard to pick one to recommend to you guys or to pick as my favorite. But let me list the two, right? The one titled Lessons We Learned from Heartbreak. That was really good. They had a guest called Jules, I believe, on that episode. And I think one of the ladies just recently got, her heart broken, or, she had a breakup or experienced a breakup. So it was fresh and it was just really heartfelt. I really enjoyed. In fact, I think that's the one I'll recommend. And that's the one that's my favorite. But just as a substitute, right? And their episodes on sex do really well. And this one that I'm going to mention is the one on sex. It's the one where that's titled "Stop Doing This During Sex." So yeah, that's my second favorite. I think that episode has about 500,000 views. So yeah, I mean, those ladies. There's recently, I think the last episode of their podcast that I listened to was the one where they talked about their first time, when they lost their virginity and all that. So yeah, suffice to say, there's a lot of sex talk on that podcast, which makes it so awesome. They recently had a live event as well. I really want to watch that. Their live, so this was their second live event. I've watched the first one. I want to watch the second one. They're so spirited. It's always nice to see them interacting with their audience, right? So yeah, that's number 4, the Messy In Between podcast, or the TMI podcast, KE for Kenya. At number 3, we have Deep Dive with Ali Abdal. Many of you will probably be familiar with Ali Abdal. He's a productivity and like entrepreneurship and business and self-help, largely productivity YouTuber. He's big on YouTube, and he has his YouTube channel, but he also has his podcast, the Deep Dive with Ali Abdal, which is also available on YouTube, but it's really good as an audio only podcast. As an audio podcast. Well, it's worth saying because there are video podcasts and there are audio podcasts, right? My point is the audio version of the podcast is also really good. And on the podcast, he interviews different thought leaders, business owners, creatives and creators, and they really do dive into what the person's about, what their venture is about, who they are, and it's incredibly insightful. It's very intelligent, I really, really love Ali Abdaal's podcast. I've watched, and this is another podcast that I watch more of it than I watch it more than I listen to it. So I do the video version more than I do the audio version. My favorite episode of Deep Dive would be the one where he had Matthew Hussey, who is a dating and relationship coach. Oh, my phone is ringing, and it's my carrier, i.e. the phone company, advertising something. Sorry about that. Matthew Hussey's episode was very insightful. He's a dating and relationship coach, like I said. I really, really enjoyed that episode. Now, at number 2, I can't believe I've breezed through, I almost breezed through all 10 so quickly. At number 2, we have the Financial Confessions podcast. Yeah. Is it the Financial Confessions or the Financial Diet? I do believe it's the Financial Confessions because, TFD has its own, platform or thing on YouTube. But I think the Financial Confessions, which is the podcast, is where Chelsea Fagan interviews. Well, sometimes she does it alone, but predominantly, she interviews different people, largely people in the finance space or the business space, right? And they talk about money, all things money. They really tear down the walls and really get into the nuts and bolts of the person's business, or how they make money, how they stay above water and all that business wise. And it's a very the way Chelsea interviews is very unique. I really appreciate it. I think that's what I love most about the Financial Confessions. She interviews in such a unique way, and her perspective on money and financial empowerment is just top notch. I just really, really enjoy listening to her talk and watching her interview her guests on the Financial Confessions. Do I have a favorite? Yes, I do have a favorite episode of that. It's one from maybe 2 years ago. It's the one where she interviewed Graham Stephan, who is the host of the Iced Coffee Hour, which I mentioned not long ago. So my favorite episode of the Financial Confessions is the one where she interviewed Graham. Just seeing two thought leaders in the personal finance space or in the finance space generally talk to one another was just it was like seeing a DC character and a Marvel character just being in the same film. It was a fantastic collaboration. I really enjoyed that episode. So that's my favorite episode of the Financial Confessions. And my number 1 favorite podcast that's not from Nigeria in podcast world is Tuxedo Time. It's a podcast called Tuxedo Time. It's hosted by husband and wife duo Becky and Chris, who have a YouTube channel called Becky and Chris, that channel is about photography, video, travel and helicopter stuff, and lifestyle generally. It's a very interesting. Is it niche? It's not for everyone, but it's a really good podcast. The people who know the Becky and Chris Becky and Chris YouTube channel, they know it and they love it. It's one of those you either love it or you hate it type of podcasts, right? Their banter is really good. They're just a very wholesome couple, and I love their content. But there are things they want to talk about in long form and not in a 7 or 12 minute YouTube video. And for that, I believe they created the Tuxedo Time, which it used to be housed on their YouTube channel, but then they created a separate YouTube channel for this podcast called Tuxedo Time. And I think it's when I'm not sure, but I think it's when they created the YouTube channel for Tuxedo Time that they also made it a podcast. I'll need to confirm that. I may be wrong, but it exists on audio, podcasts, but it also has its own YouTube channel called Tuxedo Time. Now, what they do on the podcast is that they talk about video making, photography, travel, the creator economy and stuff like that, and basically things that interest them. And they're just sitting down on their sofas, and they wear hoodies and joggers essentially, which they call their tuxedos, and they just have very interesting conversations that only a husband and wife that Becky and Chris would have. It's very interesting. It's a bit niche, if I'm being honest. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but if you're into photography, video, the creator economy, renovations and lifestyle and decor, it's a somewhat wide range of things that they talk about on their podcast. If you're into any of those things, then I think you'll enjoy the Tuxedo Time. The episode of Tuxedo Time that I'd recommend, and that's my favorite, is the one where they talked about vlogs. And if I'll get the title now, but what they talked about, or what that video was about, or that episode was about, was if you can successfully grow a YouTube channel by doing vlogs. Because once upon a time, that was a thing, the era of Casey Neistat and whatnot, where daily vlogging or weekly vlogging was really big on YouTube, and people would grow from that. Vlogging still exists, but it's not as popular. Anyway, the title of that particular episode was, Can You Grow a YouTube Channel with Vlogs? Duh. And that's my favorite episode of Tuxedo Time. And Tuxedo Time is my favorite, and probably one of the first non-Nigerian podcasts that I started listening to, which is, I think, for sentimental reasons, why it's at number one. Yeah, my favorite podcast, Tuxedo Time. I think like 7 or 8 of these podcasts are available in video form on YouTube. I think the only one that doesn't exist in video form is How to Take Over the World. All the rest are on YouTube. Yeah, there are video podcasts, and to be honest, I watch them on YouTube rather than listen to them on Apple Podcasts, or, well, I'm not on Spotify as a listener. I'm on Spotify as a creator, but I listen to my podcasts on Apple Podcasts. By the way, guys, where do you guys listen to your podcasts? It is International Podcast Day, so we might as well talk about that. Where do you listen to your podcasts? Is it Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Vibeo, SoundCloud? I believe is one of them. Where do you listen to podcasts? Let me know in the comment section, or you can DM me. My Instagram handle and my Twitter handle is @Eniolatito. So let me know how you consume your podcasts, and let me know what some of your favorite podcasts are as well. Yes, that was fun. Like I said, in season 2, I will talk about my top 10 Nigerian podcasts. Yeah, and that should be interesting. To be honest, I don't know if I have up to 10, but I think I have enough time to discover a few to pad it up and make it a top 10. If I can't, it'll maybe just be a top 5. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's podcast, or today's episode of the podcast. I really enjoyed it. This is one episode that I've been looking forward to doing for a very long time. I'm glad I've gotten it out of the way. Thank you for listening to my podcast for these 13 weeks. Some of you come back each week. I can't believe it. A special shout out to those of you who listen to the audio version on, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. There are many of you who wait, and my numbers, to be honest, are better on YouTube with the podcast, probably for obvious reasons, because it's easier to discover or to be reminded of a podcast on a platform on like YouTube than it is on a platform on like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can stumble on stuff on YouTube, but on the podcast platforms, as if you have to go there specifically for what you're going there for. So therefore, I think that's why my numbers are a bit lower on the audio podcast platforms. Thank you guys so much for tuning in each week. 13 weeks. I can scarcely believe it right now. 3 months. Wow. I look forward to season 2. I need to really think about how I want to maybe switch things up, the topics I want to talk about, and reevaluate, whether for how much longer I want to continue doing a podcast. Fun fact, when starting this podcast, I said I wanted this to be a limited, well, how did I phrase it? Limited edition, a limited series. Yes, a limited series podcast, meaning that this podcast will only exist for a certain amount or a certain number of episodes, after which it will be, packed up and put away. That may still be in effect, but the truth is I don't know when I want to end the podcast for good, or if I will end it for good. But it's saying that it's a limited series podcast, I think will give me the opportunity to one day pack things up if I want to. I know I shouldn't be saying that, but to be honest, it's good to, look at like a show like Insecure or Friends, so you need to know when it's time to say goodbye. like now. It's really time to say goodbye on this episode, right? But I just wanted to put it out there that this may be a limited series podcast, which someday far in the future, hopefully, I'll hang up the boots. But who knows, if it does well really successfully, it may continue going on for a very long time. It's hard to believe that podcasting has been around for over 10 years at this point. I mean, this is the 9th International Podcast Day, but I want to believe that, podcasting has existed for longer than 9 years. Interesting times we live in. It's been an interesting journey as well. Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast, or this episode of the podcast, the finale, the season 1 finale, episode 13. If you enjoyed it and you're watching this, my chair is making noise. Maybe in season 2, I'll change my chair. If you enjoyed this episode and you're watching it on YouTube, do me a favor and like it by clicking on the like button, and subscribe to my channel as well by clicking on the black subscribe button. On this channel, I don't just do podcast or this podcast. On this channel, I don't just have this podcast. I also review Nollywood content or movies. You can check that out as well. I do lots of things. I do other things on this YouTube channel, so check them out. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment below. Let me know what your favorite podcast is, either in the comments or in my DMs. And I will see you guys in season 2 of the 30-minute podcast. Take care, guys. Peace.